We have officially made it into the offseason of the St. Louis Dragons franchise. This is going to be our second offseason of the series, and definitely an important one at that. With over $100 million to spend, a lot of guys we have to re-sign, and a top 10 pick in this year's draft, this offseason will be pivotal in the long-term direction of our St. Louis Dragons. In the last episode, we did our season recap, recapping our own team season, along with the rest of the NFL season and the college football season, headlined by Dasani Madison, the quarterback out of Alabama, having a historic Heisman season, leading the Crimson Tide to a national championship. We ended up going 6-10-1, but I do feel like this season was a real step in the right direction. We found our focal points on both sides of the ball with Puma Whitlock and Simeon Bonnet. We had guys really break out like tight end Isaiah Likely to really put themselves into our team's future. And now going into the offseason, we have some money to play with, but over half of our starters from last year are not under contract. Even though the Dragons team, in a sense, is young because we've only been in the NFL for 2 years, our roster is actually one of the older rosters in the NFL. And realistically, a lot of these guys, obviously not the youngsters, but some of the older players are going to be starting to regress. Mostly guys who are not under contract for next year. As you can see here, it is a long list of players who we have to re-sign. So yes, that $107 million in cap space sure looks nice until you take into account that we have so many guys we have to re-sign if we even choose to, or if we end up letting a lot of these guys ultimately hit the open market. Before we get started, though, with the offseason, we do have to go over the studs and duds of the year, which, for those who need a refresher, is basically my system to reward players who performed well and punish players who play poorly. So we will start with the stud of the year, and the winner ends up being Simeon Bonnet, the rookie pass rusher out of Tennessee. He got the most votes pretty comfortably. No complaints here. Bonnet had an unbelievable season. He was the best player on our entire roster, led the entire NFL in tackles for loss. 12.5 sacks is utterly ridiculous for a rookie. And yes, Bonnet did have more expectations than the other guys eligible for stud of the year, but he was just that good. So as a result, his overall rating will go up by 3. He is now a 90 overall, and if you account for morale, he is now a 92. What a rookie season for Simeon Bonnet, who was drafted as an 80 overall with normal development, and in just his first season, his rating has gone up by 10, and his development trait has gone from the bottom, normal, to the top, Superstar X Factor, and he's just 22 years old next year. What a building block we have now in the middle of our defense for our future. Tight end Isaiah Likely ended up getting second place. Likely was a backup last year. We gave him the reins as the starting tight end, and he really did not look back. He was far and away the most reliable weapon on our offense and is very deserving of this ratings boost. He performed really well down the stretch. It was very clear that Puma Whitlock was comfortable throwing him the football, and so his overall rating will go up by 2. Don't forget, the highest voted player usually goes up in development trait unless they already have throughout the season. Simeon Bonnet already went up in dev this year, obviously, and then Isaiah Likely did. He went up from star to superstar manually from the game. So his development trait will stay at superstar, but he is now an 81 overall. Not accounting for the morale boost, he is a 79. Owen Pappoe ends up getting third place. He obviously had a great season as well. Nearly 100 tackles, 13 for a loss, 3.5 sacks, and 3 interceptions. He went from a special teamer last year to a very positive starter. We saw a little bit of flashes with him last season that led to us not going after linebackers in the offseason and instead riding it out with him, and it paid off. His rating will go up by 1, and since the other 2 stud of the year candidates were not eligible to go up in development trait, he will by default. So Owen Pappoe now has star development. He is now a 75 overall with morale, 73 without the morale boost. So Simeon Bonnet, Isaiah Likely, and Owen Pappoe all get nice boosts. But what about our duds of the year, the guys who are going down? Puma Whitlock got sacked more times than anybody across the NFL this season. And with there being no real scapegoat on the offensive line, I decided to punish everybody. The offensive line ended up losing the dud of the year pretty convincingly, and so everybody will be punished. I was originally going to do -3 for everybody's blocking stats, but I felt like that was too much. Instead, we're going to do -3 for everybody's pass blocking stats, and pretty much all of the offensive linemen went down by either 1 or 2 ratings. Emmanuel Ogbah gets second place. He was just mostly a non-factor this year, only 1 sack after week 3. And so his rating will go down by 2, and his development trait will go down to normal, considering he is the highest voted eligible player. So he is down to a 78, and he now only has normal. I don't think the development trait change is too big of a deal because he's in his 30s and he's past his real stage of progression. But it certainly is not ideal for him, as he's likely going to go down continuously with his age. With Ogbah's contract getting restructured last offseason, he is currently slated to make a lot of money. He could be a cut candidate with his savings number being a lot higher than his potential cap penalty. Will Dissly ended up getting 3rd place, and he was kind of a weird case because it's not that he was bad this year. He wasn't even a starter. The problem that I had with Dissly is that he was the starter last year at tight end. He was very pedestrian. We put Isaiah Likely in, and he becomes statistically the best tight end in the NFC. So I think that does speak a little bit to Will Dissly being significantly worse than a guy like Isaiah Likely, even if their ratings suggest otherwise. Likely obviously had better QB play, but their stats were very far apart as starters. His ratings will only go down by 1. Not a huge dip, but it's certainly not nothing for a guy who's 29 years old on the verge of potential regression. So with that, we can now actually get the offseason started, and that will start with retirements and coach firings. We'll start with retirements, and there was a long list of relevant and potentially future Hall of Fame players within this retirements class. Taylor Lewan, Patrick Peterson, Cameron Jordan, Zach Ertz retires in Washington. That feels wrong. Chandler Jones, Demario Davis, Adam Thielen, Trent Williams, first ballot Hall of Famer, Darius Slay, Teron Armstead, Zach Martin, a lot of Hall of Famers on the offensive line. Travis Kelce's a Hall of Famer. Russell Wilson's a Hall of Famer. Broncos are going to be looking for a new quarterback, while Taylor Swift's boyfriend gets to enjoy the sunset, even though he really hasn't gotten worse at all. There were some notable free agents who retired as well, including Matt Ryan. We also had some coaches get fired from some of the lesser teams in the league, and we will start with the New Orleans Saints, who will be canning Dennis Allen after 3 seasons. The Saints had the worst record in the league this year, 3-14. They got the #1 pick, and they're clearing house. They've tried to keep this championship window open for too long, and it's backfired. Seahawks offensive coordinator Shane Waldron will become the new head coach. He is the leader of the Geno Smith revival, and the Saints are hoping he can help their likely new quarterback. Kevin Stefanski out in Cleveland. The Browns paying Deshaun Watson has sent them into purgatory. They already had to trade away Nick Chubb, who they would not have had enough money to re-sign. They'll be hiring Mike McDonald, going within the division, hiring the defensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens. The Browns still have plenty of high-end talent, and they're going to have an opportunity at one of these great quarterback prospects, but their future looks bleak. The Colts fire Shane Steichen after just 2 seasons. They hoped that he would be able to develop Anthony Richardson. However, Anthony Richardson loves throwing the ball to the other team. Drew Petzing, he was supposed to be the offensive coordinator of the Cardinals before we banished them from the league. He'll be the new head coach. He's been bouncing around as a young offensive mind. The Buccaneers are the final team here, and this one's a surprise. They fired their head coach last year, and they hired Ben Johnson, a very highly sought-after candidate from the Lions. He's out after 1 year and will be replaced by Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator of the Texans, who's been a big piece in the development of C.J. Stroud so far, helping lead the Texans to a division title and a playoff win in just Stroud's 2nd season. Now it's time to go through re-signings. We have 29 players up for contract extensions, many of whom are starters. The 3rd mock draft installment is also up, and I will point out that there are some interesting things here. They had the Saints passing on both of the elite quarterbacks for Chandre Bigsley, the pass rusher out of Minnesota. On one hand, there's no way that happens. But on the other hand, that's what we said last year about the Buccaneers drafting Solomane Sumaro, and here we are. That's exactly what happened. They have Callaghan October not only falling, but falling to the 21st pick where the Giants scoop him up. I can tell you for certainty, unless he kills somebody within the next month, that will not be happening. So now we can dive into re-signings. Let's splurge some money, shall we? We've got a little over $100 million in cap space and a lot of guys we need to pay. Again, over half of our starters are here. Many of these guys are getting a little bit older. Many of these guys, though, very good long-term pieces for our future. So we have plenty of money, and we have plenty of cut candidates as well. Guys like Agba, Wiley, Trubisky, Bozeman, top 4 in savings. None of these guys have substantial penalties and could all be guys we could cut depending on how much money we need. $107 million looks like a lot, but that number will probably go substantially down after re-signings, and obviously we're going to want to spend in free agency. We'll start with Jeff Okudah, who played on the franchise tag last year. I think he's been one of the more underrated players on this defense. I think it's worth it to lock him up. Make him our #1 corner of the future. A 3-year deal for $13.5 million is enough to bring him back. I'm happy that Jeff Okudah is going to stick around for the long haul. And yes, it's a lot of money. We're giving him $40.5 million over 3 years. But for his production, I think it's worth it. Let's talk about these running backs, Joe Mixon and DeAndre Swift, who I think in terms of production this year were very even, but there is a noticeable difference between the two of them. Mixon is 3 years older, and Mixon's asking for a longer contract, and he's asking for more money. Why would we pay Mixon over a guy like DeAndre Swift, who's just as good, younger, and cheaper? I'm not opposed to having both of these guys back, but I feel like that's investing a lot into a backfield. And of the two, I think it just makes more sense to stick with Swift. 2-year extension for around $15.5 million is accepted. We had to overpay him last year to get him to stick around. Now we get him for less money, but for 2 years. I think Swift can be the lead rusher. We're going to need somebody else with him. Maybe that's Joe Mixon. Maybe not. We're not going to give an offer to Mixon right now. The only reason why we got him during the offseason was for him to be a rental. He's a 29-year-old running back who ratings-wise has regressed a lot, and he was not as good as he was last year in Cincinnati. I still feel like it was a good trade because having the run game available for Puma Whitlock really helped out the offense, and he was solid in the pass game, but I think it's in our best interest to let him walk unless we can get him for cheaper. I like what Jordan Whitehead was able to provide in the secondary. 92 tackles, 10 for a loss, made plenty of plays. I would like to have him back for another year or two. 1-year deal for around $6 million I think is pretty fair, similar to the contract that we gave him on the open market last year. And unfortunately, he says no. The franchise tag is not going to happen, so he's going to hit the open market for now. I think Jelani Tavai has been pretty solid as our third linebacker behind Devin White and Owen Popo. He plays a lot in early down packages, and I think he's been pretty good when healthy. He did miss some games this year. We're going to look to give him a 2-year deal for around $10 million total, and he says no. Not ideal. Joseph Ossai's been a solid rotational pass rusher. He really started to show some flashes this year, and I think he can be more than that long term. I think extending him at the right price would be a good move, and I think we're looking at 2 years for around $14 million, and he says no. We're getting a lot of misses here after re-signing Okudah and Swift. We haven't been so lucky. Javon Kinlaw has been a really good player when healthy. The problem is he is never healthy, but I want to give him another shot. I see the flashes. He declines our 1-year deal. Devonte Wyatt was only here for 1 game. I thought he played quite well, though, against the Packers, and I'm willing to invest a little bit. 1 year for a little over $5 million I think would be a good deal. He says no. Jesus Christ, nobody wants to re-sign. We're going to offer some depth guys. Chuck Reed, the undrafted rookie safety out of Northern Iowa. He says no. What about Damar Hamlin? He doesn't want too much money. He started a few games early in the year. He says no. So after all that, we only re-signed 2 guys. Now, the 2 guys we re-signed were my top 2 priorities coming into the re-signings phase, Okudah and Swift, but nobody else accepts, and we're not even offering other guys like Michael Thomas, who did play better down the stretch, but I'd rather move on, get younger at the wide receiver position. None of our 4 offensive linemen starters from last year got an offer, and we're also not going to be accepting Kenyon Green's 5th-year option. We are looking to completely revamp the offensive line. Levi Onwuzurike didn't get an offer. I think that's too much for a guy who can't consistently stay on the field. Rock Ya-Sin, I think, is a pretty good player, but I'd rather get younger at the cornerback position, and I think $7 million is a little bit much, especially with the investment in Okudah and a really good cornerback class upcoming. I think it would just make more sense to go younger. And then Presley Harvin, I thought he was pretty good last year, but I'd rather just save the money and not sign him now. Rather sign him later, whether that's in free agency or after the draft. So we're letting a lot of guys go. At the 29 players who were up for re-signings, 27 of them will be hitting the open market with the exceptions of Jeff Okudah and DeAndre Swift. So with that, we will be entering free agency with a lot of money to spend. Okudah and Swift are going to cost around $20 million annually. So we're going to have $87 million and a lot of room on this roster, only having 42 players currently under contract. So now it's time for the moment of truth. What does this year's free agency class look like? And at the top, you'll notice a trend. The 49ers lost a very large chunk of their core. They had to restructure a bunch of contracts last year to bring back Nick Bosa, and it's going to cost them this year. They had to pick between like 5 players to get the franchise tag to, ultimately opting for Talanoa Hufanga, leading to Brandon Ayuk, Travarius Ward, Dre Greenlaw, amongst others, entering the open market. There's a lot of talent on the offensive line. There's a lot of talent at wide receiver, and there's a lot of talent in the secondary. 3 areas of this team that need to be improved. The quarterback market is led by Jared Goff, who was let go by Detroit with his contract up. And then Geno Smith and Derek Carr were both cap casualties and ended up getting cut. The Saints presumably will draft a quarterback #1 overall, while Seattle seems to like what they have with the rookie Bryson Bowen, who started a few games early in the season. Hendon Hooker won't start for Detroit. He ended up getting cut. So the Lions don't have a quarterback on their roster. So we're going to start our free agency by talking about the offensive line. We have only one starter from last year's line back on the roster, and we're going to have to pay some guys. Again, we have players who we can cut if we don't have enough money for all of these offers, but for now, we're going to hold off with the exception of Andrew Wiley. I just don't see a reason to really keep him. The savings we would get by releasing him is a lot more than the penalty. He was not going to start next year, so he's out the door. We've now got $94.7 million to spend, and we're going to spend a lot of that on the O-line. Protect Puma Whitlock, get guys to block in front of DeAndre Swift, along with whoever else plays running back. And that starts with Tyron Smith, who at 34 years old is still one of the best left tackles in the NFL. Obviously, this is not a long-term signing for us, expecting him to retire within the next year or two, but he hasn't lost a step, and I'm willing to give him a 2-year player-friendly deal. He hasn't gotten a lot of interest yet, surprisingly, so I think he'll be inclined to take our contract because it gives him multiple years and an option if he wants to keep playing after this season. Along with getting linemen who are good right now, I would also like to look at guys who can be here for the long haul, and I think Jedrick Wills is somebody who can start for us now and be an upgrade to what we've had, but at 26 years old, be a guy who can be a foundational piece for us and maybe the long-term blindside tackle for Puma Whitlock. We're going to give him a pretty big 3-year contract for close to $14 million a year, 42 total. I think that's worth it for a guy like him. We need a new center with Drew Dahlman gone and Bradley Bozeman being a potential cut candidate. Ryan Jensen is still one of the better centers in the league. He's actually the 3rd-ranked center in the entire game. Like Tyron Smith, he's 34 years old. He's probably not going to play that much longer, but he's still a very, very high-level player at this stage of his career, and we're going to give him a similar contract to that of Tyron Smith. It'll be less money, but we're going to give him 2 years to give him the option to stick around next year. If these 2 guys were to stick around after this year, that's great. If not, we'd get that money back. It'd be all good. So we're going after 3 guys right away on the offensive line, not messing around, but we still have 2 more offers for this first stage. I want to add to the pass rush. There's not a ton of great choices here, so we're again going to go with the strategy of going for old, but someone who's still very good in Khalil Mack, who at 34 years old is still playing at a very high level, 19 TFLs and 12.5 sacks last year with the Chargers. We saw him against us back in Week 11, and he was dominant. 4 TFLs, 2.5 sacks. Another guy who probably doesn't stick around too much longer, but I think he can be really good opposite of Simeon Bonnet. He can be a good mentor for Simeon Bonnet as well, along with the fact that he's still a really good player. So we'll give him a 1-year deal for around $9 million. I'm surprised that he doesn't want more money, but hey, I'm not complaining. We have one more offer here available for this first stage. I can hear you guys screaming through your screens about Brandon Ayuk. And yes, we're going to give him an offer. Brandon Ayuk has been one of my favorite players in the entire league for a long time. Ever since he was in college at Arizona State, I saw the potential with this kid, and I was super high on him coming out of school, and I have been completely right about him. Brandon Aiyuk has become one of the best receivers in the NFL. I would make the argument that he is the best wide receiver on the San Francisco 49ers roster. Well, he's not on the Niners anymore. He's been very good the last few years, albeit under 1,000 yards because of injuries. But if he was healthy, he'd had 3 consecutive seasons of 1,000 yards. This is the perfect number 1 receiver for Puma Whitlock because he can do everything. He's very crafty with the ball in his hands. He's a good route runner. He has good hands. He's a good separator, and he checks off all the boxes you look for in an alpha wide receiver, which is exactly what this team has been missing. Griffin Weaver's a talented player, but he's not going to be a number 1 receiver in this league. You know who is? Brandon Aiyuk. The Texans and the Panthers are giving him strong bids as well as us, so hopefully we can poach him away from our division rivals. Those are going to be our 5 offers here in Stage 1. I wanted to take big swings this year, and that's exactly what we're doing, going after 5 really, really good players. We're not so much focused on age. We're focused on guys who can really help out this team. So, as you can see here, after simulating through the first stage of free agency, most of our cap space is gone. That's a good sign. We have $38 million left. That means everybody except for 1 player has accepted. So the good news is that we did end up signing the 3 offensive linemen, Tyron Smith, Jedrick Wills, and Ryan Jensen. We also signed Khalil Mack to help the pass rush, but unfortunately we lose for Brandon Aiyuk sweepstakes. He ends up signing with the Houston Texans. So he's out of our division, thankfully. We don't have to worry about playing him twice a year, but unfortunately, he will not be on our team. He'll be catching passes from C.J. Stroud. Love that signing for Houston after winning the division last year, getting an alpha receiver for Stroud, and a team who very clearly has not been afraid to be aggressive. We now have 10 offers available. We have around $40 million to spend and still plenty of other guys who I think would make sense for our team. So as I'm going through offers on our next 10 players, it becomes abundantly clear to me that we are not going to have enough money for all the guys that I want. So because of that, luckily, we have some options in terms of cut candidates who we can get rid of. Ryan Jensen is now the full-time starting center. Drew Dalman is gone. Bradley Bozeman is a big cap hit. He's gone, and he saves us a lot of money. Emmanuel Ogbah also saves us $17 million, and with the addition of Khalil Mack, there's no real reason to have him. So we're going to save $22 million in cap space by cutting Bozeman and Ogbah, and we now have around $60 million that we can play with. So of our 10 offers, we're going after some familiar faces along with some new players. Most notably, I did decide to give Joe Mixon a very lucrative 1-year deal. It seems like he's getting better long-term offers elsewhere, but I figured it's worth a shot. We're going after some other familiar faces like Jordan Whitehead, Jelani Tavai, Joseph Osai, along with some new potential starters on defense such as Eric Stokes and Aleem McNeil, along with depth pieces such as Tommy Tremble, Aaron Brewer, Chad Muma, along with looking to bring back Javon Kinlaw. So now it's time to simulate into Stage 3 of free agency. Our 43 players on the roster goes up to 50. So we ended up signing 7 of the 10 players who we offered for. We were able to bring back a lot of familiar faces, such as Jordan Whitehead, Jelani Tavai, Joseph Osai. We also signed Eric Stokes, who I think could have a nice role into secondary. We still have Javon Kinlaw up for bidding, and we had 2 guys sign elsewhere. Joe Mixon signs a 3-year deal with Minnesota. I was not willing to give him 3 years, so he'll be the new starting running back of the Vikings, and then Aleem McNeil re-signs with Detroit. As a Lions fan, thank God, as the Dragons, it would have been really nice to have Aleem McNeil because I think he's such a good player. So we're going to go after some more depth here in this final stage. David Montgomery in particular. In case we don't get a running back in the draft, we need somebody who can be the short yardage runner. The contract is fully non-guaranteed for Montgomery, so in case we do draft somebody, we could cut him pretty easily. And I also want to bring back our 2 previous safeties, Hamlin and Reed. There are still some good players here in free agency, but there's nobody who I really want for us, and with only $15 million in cap space, assuming everybody accepts, we don't have that much money to play with. But I do want to look at the trade market, and this is usually the stage of the offseason where I like to make my deals. In free agency, we have significantly revamped the offensive line. That issue hasn't necessarily been totally fixed, but it's a lot better. Defensively is pretty similar. We added Eric Stokes, we added Khalil Mack, but for the most part, the defense is very similar to what it was last year, but the receiving core hasn't got better. We let go of Michael Thomas, and we haven't added anybody. During the trade deadline, I talked about Jameson Williams in Detroit as a guy who I think could be a really good fit. JMO is a St. Louis native, and he's got all the talent in the world. This is a superbly physically gifted player who showed off his elite upside during his junior season at the University of Alabama. It just hasn't translated in the NFL for whatever reason, and he was kind of an afterthought this year in the Lions offense. He did play a little bit better down the stretch, but with Detroit declining his fifth-year option, it's very clear that they are not committed to him as a long-term piece in the future. When we played the Lions in Week 14, he was a non-factor. 0 catches. The only thing he did was fumble a punt return. The Lions already have Amon-Ra St. Brown and Mike Williams on big deals. They have Treylon Burks as well. I think it could make sense for them to try to get value while they can for Jameson Williams. When we tried to trade for him at the deadline, we offered a third-round pick, and that was in the yellow. However, I think it's going to be easier to get Jameson Williams now with Detroit declining the fifth-year option and with it becoming very clear that he's not going to be a piece of this future. I still think we're going to have to add a little bit more. I get that JMO hasn't panned out in Detroit, but I think the Lions are still going to want to get quite a bit for him. So we will add to this deal, adding Leo Chenal in exchange for a fifth-round pick. I like Leo Chenal a lot. He's a player I was very high on coming out of college, and I still see the upside with him as a starting linebacker. The unfortunate thing here is that it just didn't really work out. He's had a hard time staying on the field, which has also been an issue with Jameson Williams. Chenal's been a solid special teamer, but he just got overlapped essentially by the emergence of Owen Popo. He's missed 11 games over the last 2 years, and I think a new scenery for him, such as Detroit, could make sense. So ultimately, the deal is accepted. A third-round pick and Leo Chenal to the Lions for Jameson Williams and a fifth-round pick. We've been waiting to acquire somebody with the upside of an alpha receiver, and that's exactly what Jameson Williams brings to the table. He hasn't really been able to do it in Detroit. He never really got on the same page with Jared Goff, but I think the type of quarterback that Puma Whitlock is will be a better fit for him. I think Jameson Williams still has so much talent and so much untapped potential. If it doesn't work out, it's fine. He's on the last year of his deal. It's not a long-term financial binding that we're putting ourselves into. With the addition of JMO, we don't really need Denzel Mims anymore. I thought he showed some good flashes in Season 1, but he just was buried down the depth chart last year. He's going to go to the Saints for the top pick in the 6th round. So after those 2 moves, we only have 2 picks in the top 100, but we have 7 picks on day 3, including 4 picks in the 5th round. If you remember last year, we ended up with 5 picks in the 5th round. We're trying to potentially one-up ourselves with all these 5th round picks. And we drafted some good players last year in round 5, like Tykeem Keon Jr., Trajan Blyjenden, and Demore Diggins. Let's take a look at some trades around the rest of the NFL. We'll start with Atlanta trading Grady Jarrett to the Bears for a 4th round pick. Seems pretty weird for the #1 seed in the NFC to trade one of their better defensive players, but there's a reason. They'll be trading their 3rd round pick for John Franklin Myers, who's younger and better. The Jets get to open up space for their younger pass rushers, the Bears get somebody to help their defense, and Atlanta gets an upgrade without having to give up too much. Win-win-win. Jamal Adams is going to the Steelers for 2 4th round picks. The Steelers secondary is looking really nice. They signed Charvarius Ward. They obviously have Minkah Fitzpatrick. They drafted Victor Ridgewood in the 2nd round last year, and now they have Jamal Adams. DJ Moore's been a massive flop in Chicago. He's going to the Dallas Cowboys for a 3rd and 6th round pick. The Cowboys obviously nearly won the Super Bowl this year, losing to New England. They lost Brandon Cooks, so now they get an upgrade, pairing him up with CeeDee Lamb and Dynamite Williams in what is now one of the best wide receiver trios in the NFL. Next up, we've got another pretty big move here with a wide receiver, John Mechie, going to the Packers. Green Bay's looking for another starter. Houston doesn't need him anymore with the addition of Brandon Ayuk. And then last but not least, we've got Andrew Booth Jr. going to the Philadelphia Eagles. Darius Slay retired. The Eagles don't have a replacement for him, whereas the Vikings have plenty of depth at corner. Minnesota's going to get a 5th round pick in exchange for him. Let's take a look at the free agency recap, taking a look at all of our moves along with the signings across the rest of the league. And overall, I think we did a pretty good job. We were able to fill up some holes. We completely revamped the offensive line, adding Tyron Smith, Ryan Jensen, and Jedrick Wills. We added the pass rush with Khalil Mack. We get a potential game changer at wide receiver with Jameson Williams if everything pans out. And we bring back a lot of our depth players as well. The San Francisco 49ers sure lost a lot of talent. Brandon Aiyuk, we already talked about him. He is with the Texans. Travarius Ward, we also mentioned him already. He ended up signing with the Steelers, who now, again, have a very good secondary. Dre Greenlaw signed with the Philadelphia Eagles. Yes, Howie Roseman invested money into the linebacker position. Never thought I would see the day, but here we are. Joe Mixon, of course, to Minnesota. DeAndre Hopkins to Washington. Quandre Diggs to the Eagles. His good friend Darius Slay retired, but now he is there patrolling the back end of the secondary. Greg Newsome and Tyrann Mathieu to the Broncos. I thought about Greg Newsome. He could have been a really good addition, but Eric Stokes is a lot cheaper, and again, it's a loaded cornerback class. Rock Ya-Sin to Minnesota is kind of interesting. Him and Joe Mixon, teammates once again. And it's interesting because obviously our offensive leaders and our defensive leaders clashed during the season. And both of those guys were team captains, but clearly there's no animosity between the two of them. Some other notable moves here include Elijah Moore to the Titans. They can't have enough receivers. Levante David to the Vikings. Only 2 quarterbacks signed. Geno Smith to New Orleans. I would imagine that's as a placeholder or a mentor for whoever they draft with the #1 pick, whether it's Callaghan October or Dasani Madison. Derek Carr signs with the Broncos. He'll be the starter for now. Jared Goff remains unsigned. I know there were a lot of teams interested in him, but he doesn't sign anywhere for now. I assume he'll get a job pretty early on in the preseason with whoever gets left out of the quarterback carousel into the NFL draft. So that's going to wrap up free agency. Let me know what you thought of our moves down below. Again, I thought we had a really successful free agency, addressing the offensive line, making some moves on defense, adding Jameson Williams. Next episode will be the 2025 NFL Draft Preview. We're going to go through the entire draft class once again. A bunch of guys have moved up and down the board since the end of the season and with the NFL Combine. So we're really going to dive into those guys and sort of set the scene for what to expect in the NFL Draft, which of course will be in the following episode, and that'll be premiering likely sometime this weekend. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.